Hey, good day to you all. This is the Converging Paths podcast. I'm Eric Elness, your host, and we've got a very interesting episode for you today. We're going to be looking at how we move through this world with courage and resilience in a way that Teilhard de Chardin once said, we're all standing on thin ice, so we may as well dance. And boy, it seems like the ice is getting pretty thin these days, isn't it? With the climate change increasingly affecting our world and having less hope that we will be able to avert the catastrophic effects of climate change. We've got always the possibility of runaway warfare, including nuclear warfare. We've got unintended consequences of technological advancements that could do us in. And of course, we've got the traditional stuff like political and social kind of meltdown that can certainly change things on us in significant ways. So there's a lot of stresses, a lot of strains in our world today, to be sure. And so it does feel like the ice is getting pretty thin. And so, but we have some hope, not hope that all this will go away, but rather a hope that's far more powerful than that to bring to the fore this evening, like the kind of hope that does allow a person to dance on the thin ice. In other words, even though the ice may come crashing through at any moment, to find our humanity, to continue to find reasons for joy and meaning in life, to continue to affirm that, hey, walking this earth is worth it to me and to others. So that's a pretty profound sense of hope, really, and more realistic hope for today. We'll be getting into that. Joining me this evening is a wonderful guest I have a profound respect for, Allen Ewing-Merritt. He is besides just being a great human being, he is the executive director of the BTS Center, which is providing spiritual leadership for a climate-changed world. Notice the "duh" on. This is one of the an environmental organization that is not looking to how do we avert climate change, but acknowledging that climate change is a present reality and likely to be a future reality in increasingly disruptive ways. And so, how do we prepare for that future, the now and the future? So, very interesting. He'll be coming on later in the episode. I do want to also acknowledge that we'll be going to featuring Jesus as a guest too. He's got something to say about this, as always, something interesting and unexpected to say in a little parable that a lot of people don't quite get, called the parable of the mustard seed. A lot of people think they get it, but he's got some interesting stuff in there that is often overlooked and provides us perhaps with some clues to how do we do this little dance on the ice we're standing on. Before going on, though, I do want to acknowledge that the Converging Paths podcast is made possible through the Eden Tree Foundation, which employs present and emerging technologies for spiritual exploration and growth, while fostering interfaith understanding, empathy, and community. We are also brought to you by the good folks of Darkwood Brew, who have this message to share with you.
Finally, some real news that's cause for celebration. At Darkwood Brew, we're offering 10% off our entire library of progressive small group video resources. Access over 30 series featuring more than 120 frontline thinkers, artists, authors, and theologians with the message of hope in the face of despair. All episodes include leaders' guides and questions to inspire free-range conversations. Sign up today, save 10%, and be ready to download deliciously transformational Bible study materials in minutes. Join the revolution and save some scratch. Darkwood Brew. Cage-free Christianity for the resistance.
The good folks at Darkwood Brew have produced the world's largest collection of small group video resources meant to resource the Christian pluralist community, that is, those who have affirmed fully the path of Jesus without denying the legitimacy of other paths that God creates for humanity. Good stuff. So they say that gold is produced in an incredibly rare process that takes place in only certain places of the universe. Gold is produced when a giant star runs out of fuel and collapses in on itself. And that increasing density creates more gravity, which causes the greater collapse. And finally, it gets to be so great, the pressure becomes so great of all that collapsing in on itself that it explodes that out. And in that explosion, the pressure is so extreme, but also then the energy that's created, heat that's, they say, 100 times greater than the sun's heat, is produced in that moment of the explosion. And that's when, it's the magic happens. That's when literally atoms are ripped apart and parts of atoms join with other atoms that never could join in any other way except under that intense heat and pressure. And it creates gold. And it's the only place in the universe that process is possible. So the gold we have on Earth came from these supernovas, and it persists, even though it's billions of years removed from its time. It persists to this day, and it continues to be seen as one of the most valuable and beautiful substances around. Its value far exceeds its weight or its size, and relative to other things on Earth. And have you ever held in your hand something that was quite small, but really exceeded its size in meaning and worth to you? Maybe a newborn child, or an engagement ring, a wedding ring, made of gold. And oftentimes when two things that are joined together that are impossible to join together except under pressure or surprising energy. We know the experience of holding something so small but yet exceeding in value. And Jesus talks about, kind of reveals that within the realm of God there exists something that is quite small, really, really tiny, and yet its value far exceeds its weight or size in human estimation. And he reveals something about this in this parable called the parable of the mustard seed. It's found actually in all three Gospels, and it's found in the Gospel of Thomas. So it seems to have been considered important by the early church. And the one I'm thinking about tonight occurs in Matthew 13, but they're all basically the same. But Jesus talks about how there's this, that a mustard seed, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that then grows into the greatest of trees. And so it was so large that the birds of the air make nests and find refuge in its branches. And that's rather interesting. Most people miss it, the conundrum here, except for botanists perhaps, or gardeners. The problem with this parable is that, mustard actually doesn't grow into trees. It's a shrub, and it was known since ancient times of being an invasive shrub, almost like a weed. It grows once it's in the ground. It's just impossible to plant. Even Pliny the Elder is going on about mustard and how it's hard to get out of the ground once it's there. But it does not grow into trees. And now, if you're on the internet and you Google around, you might find images of trees that are claimed to be mustard trees, but they are not. Those are toothbrush trees, actually. And they have nothing to do with the mustard trees, not mustard seeds in Jesus's parables. No, mustard was common all around Israel. If you got a really healthy plant, it might be as tall as you are, a little taller, not much more though. That's about it. And you kind of think, was Jesus just kind of, was he a bad botanist, or was he offering horrific herbology, or what? Was his audience just kind of sitting there smirking at him like, you've obviously never planted a garden, Jesus? Was he ignorant? Well, frankly, when it comes to Jesus, whenever I think he's ignorant, I usually find that I'm the one. And I think this is the case here as well. His first century audience they're not only familiar with the botany of their area, as Jesus would have been, but also they're familiar with their scriptures, particularly the Hebrew scriptures. And when Jesus made reference to a tree that grows large and has branches in which the birds of the air nest, they likely immediately would have recognized where he was going with this. This reference, this metaphor, occurs in several places in the Hebrew Scriptures. For instance, in the prophet Daniel, when there's a story about when Nebuchadnezzar has this dream in which he dreams of this great tree that grows from the center of the earth, and then it grows huge, and then the birds of the air nest in its branches, and all living things are fed in it. And very similar to the language of the parable, Daniel is called to interpret this dream, and he says, "Well, this is you and the kingdom that you will rule over, the empire." The Jewish people would have recognized that reference to like a large political empire. They also would have perhaps remembered Ezekiel's talking about Israel herself becoming eventually a large tree under which every kind of bird will live and find shade in its branches. And so this was not an unfamiliar metaphor. What was unusual is that Jesus didn't talk about like a cedar seed creating this huge tree like you'd expect of a cedar, but rather a mustard seed. And so he's really, in a sense, offering a riddle to us. What is so small, so tiny, almost insignificant, like it could just blow away in the wind if you weren't careful? It was so tiny but it's pernicious. Like once it's planted, it grows so fast that not even the Roman Empire could stop it. I mean, that's essentially what he's teasing out in us. Something in the kingdom of God has so much power that once it's planted in the human community, it can grow so fast that it could actually take over the Roman Empire. And of course, we know from hindsight that this actually happened. In just a few short centuries, without raising any swords, this Jesus-following faith actually did become the official faith of the empire. It did grow perniciously like a mustard seed, and became this vast movement. And now we can criticize a lot of Christianity that became the empire, empire faith, but really before that, I mean, there's something that was apparently so special about it that people were literally risking their lives. Pagans were saying, "I want to be part of this faith," and they knowing full well that they could be put in jail, they could lose their jobs, they could even be executed for it. But there was something so special they found there that they decided it was worth the risk. So what is it? What is this thing that's so small that's found within the realm of God that can do this? I mean, it would be nice to have a little bit of this right about now, wouldn't it? With all the political unrest and climate change and all these things. What is that small, tiny thing? Well, happily, Jesus offers us a clue in elsewhere in the Gospel of Matthew when he also talks about mustard seed. He says, "Truly, I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." So he's revealing that this mustard seed he's really talking about, it's faith. Although I would guess it's not just any kind of faith. He's not telling us that, hey, if you just have a little faith, everything will be okay. You'd have whatever you want. Everything will be okay. I mean, if that was the kind of faith he was referring to, I mean, well, shoot, every book I've ever written would be a New York Times bestseller. And if just having a little faith meant that everything will be okay, then, my eldest daughter's brain cancer would have been vanished, long ago. I mean, there's just something that rings very hollow when you just think about, like, just have a little faith and you can accomplish the impossible. It's got to be, if Jesus is truly reflecting reality, and I think he is, he's talking about a particular kind of faith that can actually can do what is seemingly impossible. There's a difference, by the way, between faith and belief. Your beliefs change over time. We're always updating our beliefs, and beliefs tend to be formed not through direct experience, but through what we're taught. And so that's why they tend to change over time, because maybe our beliefs, wake up one day to find our beliefs don't quite match the lived reality of our lives. And so our beliefs change in relation to lived experience. Or maybe we lose faith or trust in the source that has taught us these beliefs also. But faith is really trust that's born of direct experience. So, for instance, many years ago, I held the belief that God had to kill Jesus in order to cleanse me and you of our sin. And actually, that's not something my church taught. It was something a youth group taught that my girlfriend was a part of, and they were insisting that yes, this is the way it is. And okay. But so I held that belief until I actually directly experienced the love and grace of God for myself, and realized God would never kill Jesus. I know who killed Jesus. That was us. That was us. And the amazingness of God's grace is just illustrated in the fact that we could be forgiven. Humanity could be forgiven such a great sin as to kill the chosen Messiah that God had sent. Truly far more amazing grace than we have, far more surpassing love for others than we have. So that was what makes God, God, right? So this kind of faith that Jesus is talking about has to do with trust that's built from a direct experience of the divine in some way that could be helpful, that creates a whole realm of possibilities where we thought there were none. Where does that kind of faith come from? How do we get that kind of faith, right? How do we get this faith that is a direct experience of the divine, that convinces us that we can move through fires, we can move through any obstacles in our way, that we will know that maybe it's not going to solve all of our problems, maybe it's not going to make a cancer go away, maybe it's not going to give us a New York Times bestseller. It's not going to give us necessarily what we want, but it's going to give us far more than we need to make it through. Now, how do we get that kind of faith? Well, there's an interesting story that comes from ancient times about these 40 Roman soldiers in a city called Sebaste, which is now in modern-day Turkey. They lived during the time of an emperor named Licentius, and in the early 4th century. Interesting thing about Licentius, he had actually co-signed a document with Constantine. He was a co-ruler with Constantine, who then made Christianity legal in the empire. But then Licentius changed his mind and said, no. And so he began again persecuting Christians. And there was these 40 soldiers who were condemned to death for professing a faith in Jesus. And so and they're condemned to death by freezing. So they lead these 40 soldiers out one frigid night onto a frozen pond, stark naked. And they tell them, you're going to be here until you die, unless you renounce your faith. If you renounce your faith, the emperor is a good emperor. And by the way, we have this nice warm bath on the edge of the pond you can jump in. You will be forgiven your offense, and you can go be free if you'll just renounce your faith. Well, after about an hour, one of these soldiers standing on this frigid pond naked, he just can't handle it any longer, and he renounces his faith and jumps in that warm bath. But 39 stayed there until they died. But what was even more interesting, just raised the question, like what is so powerful that they were holding on to? What is this mustard seed, this thing that was within them that was so powerful that it would cause them to have this, just stay out there rather than renounce their faith? What was, to me, very interesting is that when they counted the bodies the next day, there weren't 39. There were 40. There were 40 bodies out there on the ice, naked. What had happened was one of the soldiers was so filled with awe and wonder over what he saw out on the ice that he actually decided he would rather die with these folks connected to whatever they were connected to than live in service of the emperor any longer. So he stripped his armor off, he stripped his clothes off, and he joined them out on the ice where he died. But what is it that he witnessed? What could have possibly moved somebody to say, yeah, I'm with them? Well, since they would never live to tell the story, they can't contradict me. I'll tell you exactly what they saw. I'll give you my best guess anyway, and I don't think it would have been obvious. I think what this soldier would have witnessed at first anyway was a whole lot of people in an utter crisis of faith. I mean, wouldn't you be if you were standing out there naked on the ice? Especially, most of these are newborn Christians. They're not Jewish people who then followed Jesus as their Messiah and they've been with us for a while. These are pagans who have heard about this faith and they've been told some wondrous things. They've held some beliefs that cause them to convert, take the risk. But then now the jig is up. They've been found out and now they're standing on that cold ice on that dark night. And they're told, hey, if you just renounce your faith, you just admit that this is all a mistake, this Jesus guy is nothing, it will all be well for you. Your wife will not be a widow. Your children will not be fatherless. You'll have this nice warm bath and you'll go home. Who among us wouldn't, even as longtime Christians, start to wonder, I wonder if I've just made a big, huge mistake. And especially if those beliefs are young, they don't have a lot of experience. They've been told, hey, there's lots of freedom in Christ and surpassing joy. And yet, well, now I'm in prison for my faith and now I'm about to die for my faith. Not so happy about this. I can just imagine these 39 folks out there who are experiencing what one of those giant stars experience when they've just run out of fuel. This massive implosion of faith. A faith that seems so far distant that it's like God is like as far away as the farthest star, and they don't know what's up or down anymore. They have no idea why they ever got into this. They should probably just get the heck out of this. I think that's what would have been the first part of that experience. But certainly it couldn't have been the second because they stayed. They did not take that bath. And I think what happened to them is just kind of like what happens in those exploding stars. Certain things come together when there's intense pressure and heat, heat of the energy of panic and trying to reevaluate your whole life. Some things join together that couldn't join together in any other way except in those rare circumstances. I don't think that they found a faith out there on the ice. I think that faith found them. They experienced something very directly, a presence, an awareness. It was far more aware of them than they were aware of them. And because of that awareness, and despite that awareness, loved them beyond their wildest imagination. An awareness that provided an assurance that, it's okay, even though when things certainly don't seem any way, shape, or form okay. A presence that assured them that I'm with you. And something that they could not, that was so direct that they could not have made this up in their own minds. They could not have fashioned this. And no matter wishful thinking should have cobbled this kind of experience together. Every kind of thing that was in their head was saying, go, leave, get out of this. But something stayed with them. Something that was so precious to them, they preferred to stay with it rather than leave it. Likely, you've had experiences like this in your own life, haven't you? Where the bottom falls out from under you. Maybe you lose a relationship or a job, or you lose your own faith for whatever reasons. Life hits you unusually hard. Everything collapses. And yet, isn't it in those darkest moments where we've got nothing to add? That's when the divine, the holy shows up. I know that's the only reason I'm still a believer in God. I've tried so many times to throw away God. It doesn't make sense at all, this pain, suffering, but every time I try to throw God away, God shows up. Despite myself, not because I want God to be there. I think that's what happened. And that's that mustard seed. That is the particular kind of faith that does not make promises to you. It would make no promise that if you just have this faith, the ice will melt. No, if you have this faith, this ice ain't going to go anywhere, and you will die. Right? So it's making no false promises, but it's giving real assurance of a presence who sees you, who knows you, who is with you through thick and thin, come hell or high water, who allows you to stand on frozen ice and say, hey, instead of cringing and instead of falling into despair, why don't we dance? You want to dance? By which, I mean, especially in today's terms, as we face these radical evils that could befall us at any moment, how do we let's stay connected to our humanity. There is a presence, there is a power, there is a holiness, there is a sacredness within us all that allows us to stand on that ice and not cower and not simply run away and try to soothe our fears in the warm waters of this bath, but rather stay out there and not only stand firm, but dance in community with others. Well, speaking about dancing, I want to invite on our guest, Reverend Allen Ewing-Merritt, director of the BTS Center, who really is providing amazing spiritual leadership for a climate-changed world, as I said. And let me see if I can get him on. There's Allen. Allen, good to see you tonight.
Thanks so much, Eric. Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Can you just tell us just a little bit, what is your thumbnail executive summary of what the BTS Center does? And then what also, where did you come from? What was your path to become the executive director of the center?
Sure. So the BTS Center is the organizational successor to what used to be Bangor Theological Seminary. So our roots go back all the way to 1814, more than 200 years, to the founding of the seminary here in the Northeast, in the state of Maine. And about 13 years ago, a little less than that, 11 years ago, the seminary made the really difficult decision to close. Many freestanding small seminaries find it hard to keep going, with the changing economics of higher education and the changing religious landscape, fewer students, all that. And morphed into what we now call the BTS Center. My kids like to make fun of the name because there's a well-known K-pop band
That's
called
right.
BTS. We're not that one, but we do like to dance in a different kind of way. So yeah, we're a private operating foundation with a mission to catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership. So we do that by offering programs of spiritual and vocational formation, things like workshops, retreats, sort of longer term cohorts, learning communities, reading groups, that sort of thing. And we have people from all over the country and beyond who are plugging into our programs, all focused around cultivating and nurturing what we call spiritual leadership for a climate changed world. And yes, we put a D on that in kind of an intentionally provocative way to signal that climate change is not scientists' prediction of something that is coming off in the future, but it is here. It is now. It is the reality we're facing. I think more and more people are waking up to that every day. But it's also the primary characteristic of the world in which we're living and a primary characteristic of the world in which we're trying to do ministry and be of service. So that's a little bit about the BTS Center. And I should share that, Eric, you are one of the newest members of our board of trustees. We're really, really grateful for that and had a great time here in Maine while you were with us for our board and staff retreat this past week. So the second question you asked, a little bit about my path. I served local churches for about 20 years. I was a high school English teacher briefly before that, but served churches in New England for about 20 years. And along the way, did some nonprofit work, founded a nonprofit here in Portland, Maine that works with newly arriving asylum seekers from a bunch of different African countries, providing housing and English classes and case management and that sort of thing, and did a lot of faith-rooted community organizing, especially during the first Trump presidency. I started a group called, at the time was called Moral Movement Maine, trying to organize faith leaders and people at the grassroots around some of the issues that mattered so much, the Muslim travel ban and the repeal of the Affordable Care Act and all the things that we saw happening a few years back. And then found my way to the BTS Center about a little over 5 years ago. I've been serving in this role and just delighted to be doing this work. It's a pretty phenomenal little mustard seed kind of an organization doing, I think, really, really important work in this really fraught moment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Alan, I was preparing for this episode, and I wanted to kind of timestamp this. This will not hit our official Converging Paths podcast as an audio version probably for several months. But right now, on this particular day, we are just a couple of weeks past the presidential election. And as I was preparing for this podcast, the New York Times came out with a breaking news about the Trump's appointment of a man named Lee Zeldin to run the EPA, who plans to gut the climate rules. And who knows by the time this is, broadcasting, if he will have made it there or not, what have you. But it was just another reminder that we need organizations like the BTS Center who are already who are investing their energies. It's a good and right thing to invest your energies into averting climate change. I don't want to at all disrespect those. I've been part of organizations for many years that have been trying to avert climate change. But there's also, in the space of a movement, more and more need for groups like yours to really be focusing our energies on how do we prepare for the now better, and also really ask those really difficult questions that none of us want to ask, like what if we go over the edge on this? How is there any way to, at least if we're going to be in free fall in some way, or in some sort of collapse, maybe even civilizational collapse, any way to soften the fall a bit for ourselves and others in some way, any way to, and until then, to dance on that ice a bit. I was struck when I was with you all last week at the board meeting, how just the fact that there were people who are asking that question out loud, like, what if we go over the cliff? It was surprisingly inspiring. And it actually filled me with a lot of hope and joy, even though we're talking about like the worst thing that could happen. And I asked, why is that? How is it that you could be? And I think it was because we can get through most anything so long as we know there's others, who are along with us. And we also know, okay, I'm not crazy for thinking these kind of things. I'm not crazy. There's other people who are, or else we're all crazy. There's some comfort in that I'm not crazy and I'm not alone. And, there's a lot of things we can go through if we're not feeling alone in them. And,
absolutely. Yeah. There's a line of thinking that we shouldn't talk too much about the worst thing that could happen, because if people feel like there's nothing we can do, then they'll do worse. And I really do resonate with that. I think there's some truth to that, but what I've found in my own life is that there's nothing particularly hopeful about burying our heads in the sand. Mm-hmm. I think we know at a very deep level that something is profoundly wrong, right? We just know that. And pretending otherwise does not compel us to act in the ways that we need to be acting in this moment. I think there is actually something quite relieving to speak the truth honestly. I think many people at this point have had encounters with the truth, and when we have those encounters, I think it provokes us to ask a different kind of question, like, who is God calling us to be in this moment? Whether we're going to make it through or not, who are we called to be? And that to me feels like a really, really important question. My story is probably not that different from a lot of people's. I When I was serving churches, my ministry was always very focused on social justice issues, and I sort of thought of all the justice issues in a line. There's racial justice and economic justice and immigrant justice and LGBTQ justice, and climate justice is sort of right in that line, and had a profoundly transformative experience. I think of it as an ecological conversion, studying as part of a doctoral program with Larry Rasmussen, who's well-known Christian ethicist with an ecological focus, taught for many years at Union Seminary in New York City. And on the first day of his first lecture in this week-long cohort that I was a part of, as he started talking about the reality of climate devastation, I had this kind of mystical experience where I just knew that the BTS Center needed to turn our attention to this. And like you said, not so much to try to mitigate climate change, to stop it, because what we're seeing is not really stoppable. Although I am grateful for every effort, because there's a lot of difference in the suffering that will come from 3 degrees of warming or 4 degrees of warming. So we definitely need to be coming at it from all the angles. But for me, it was about asking this question about who we're called to be in this moment. And brought that back to the board. You weren't part of the board at the time, but I was early in my time with the BTS Center, and just sort of laid this on the table. What if we turned our attention to the reality of global climate devastation and how that intersects with spiritual leadership? And that's what we've been doing. And I think you're right. It could keep us awake at night every night. But I do think when we're connected with other people who are seeing reality for what it is, and then asking these bigger questions about vocation, like what's our calling in this moment, that's how we'll get through. That's what ultimately gives us hope.
That's really interesting. I never knew that story about what got you into this and that kind of mystical moment that kind of turned the lights on in a sense, because I really perceive that about the BTS Center itself. And this is not an advertisement for the BTS Center. I'm not saying this because I'm on the board of directors. I actually got on the board of directors because of what I'm about to say, which is it feels, and I've been familiar with the BTS Center for years, but now in this new incarnation, it feels like it has this spirit going in it. I mean, that feels like all the woo-woo buttons inside me, those mystical little buttons just start firing when I hear what the BTS Center is up to and why it's up to and these kind of things. So I felt quite mystically drawn to it because you, as an organization, and I don't know if I've ever experienced this from just an institution like this, other than certain faith communities, really exude this sense of the sum is far greater. The product is far greater than the sum of the parts that you're doing this. There's some extra jazz in this. That is quite wondrous. So I'm very excited about what you're doing and what it might bring.
Thank you. Yeah, that experience was pretty profound. It was radically reorienting for me. I was listening to this lecture, and all of a sudden, all of these ideas were coming to me, just flooding. It was like they were on download, and I'm trying to listen to Larry's lecture, but also capture what was coming to me. And it was in that experience, I just profoundly felt that the Holy Spirit was saying, this is the thing, pay attention. And fortunately, the board at the time, which was just a group of 9, was compelled by the story that I told. And of course, every member of our team has had their own different experience. I'm just sharing my own. Each of us, I think, enters into this work, but I do think often for people, there is a spiritual component to this that helps the light bulb to come on. And I'm grateful for all those stories that I hear from other people who encounter it in that way.
That's fascinating too, because I was familiar with the BTS Center board before all this just changed too, and God, I loved every one of them. I've known them for years, and I would not have perceived that board to be like the one that's going to be deliberately provocative, or really draw way far outside the lines like this. And yet, it's and just to think about them embracing this mystical experience, but that seems to be a microcosm of what's happening clear around the country in my experience. Like you think that people are going to freak out if you talk about this stuff, and they don't.
Right.
And that, I know I've been on the Zoom that you hosted with Brian McLaren's book, Life After Doom. That's the name of the book, Life After Doom. You think, oh my God, are people going to run away and never want to talk about this? And yet there's well over 100 people on that Zoom call, all really wanting to talk about this and really embracing this idea, like, yeah, we do need to go to that hard place in our mind and think this through. I even know from my experience, I'm currently finishing up an interim ministry position in Florida where it got hit by the 2 hurricanes. Even before the hurricanes hit, I trotted out the climate change stuff and those possibilities, and found even in a church in Florida, they were actually surprisingly willing to go with that, to think these things through. I think it's just I think that we've really undervalued the intelligence and the emotional and the spiritual maturity of a lot of people in our country and our world when we think, oh, we can't talk about these things. I think there's actually people who are going to increasingly be demanding that we face these things and finding more joy and possibility than when we face these things together.
Totally agree. I actually think we're in the midst of a kind of reformation that's happening where God is redirecting us back to the earth. And I think about Dinah Butler Bass's work. Probably, maybe you've encountered her book Grounded, but she talks about the ways in which, just like people feel that they can grow their own food and, brew their own beer and shop at farmers markets and sort of take control, to have agency in all the areas of their lives. They also feel a sense of agency about their spiritual life. And what's happening is people are coming to this kind of awakening that maybe God isn't always inside the 4 walls of that church with the stained glass windows that make it seem like a fortress. God is there too, of course, but God is also profoundly in the ground, in the air we breathe, in the water that surrounds us. That we can encounter God that way. Now, I want people to encounter God in community, in the natural world, right? The sort of remove the separation between what happens in the building and outside the building. And, that's happening a lot in the kind of growth of these wild churches that you've probably heard of, churches that don't have a building, people meeting outside in a grove in the woods or going for a walk and kind of deeply connecting with our more than human kin. I really think this is part of a reformation. And just like any reformation, we can't necessarily see all the textures and tones of that in the moment. But I think, looking back on it, if humanity survives, we will see this real transformation of the spiritual landscape, and we're right in the middle of it.
Is it reformation or revolution?
One or the other, or both. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's a revolution. We can be part of it.
If a caterpillar changes into a butterfly, is that a reformation or a revolution? I don't know. But I think that's kind of what's happening. Or we're in that deep goo phase with all those imaginal cells, floating around, starting to connect with each other, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And goo is messy. Yeah. And we don't know what to do with it. We just as soon skip over those parts and come to the place of more stability and certainty, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, and of course, and we've talked about this metamorphosis on the podcast before, but just a reminder that those imaginal cells, when they are activated, they're also attacked by that surrounding goo as foreign entities. But so it takes then the connecting together. Once enough of them connect together, that's when then it becomes an unstoppable force, for the new metamorphosis. And that's what happens. The butterflies. That's what happened, I think, in the early church, too. If you get enough people who are connected to this joy that comes from a source that they did not make up on their own, that came to them, that found them, not them finding it, that was really leading them to a whole nother place, than a whole nother world, trying to create another world. And we can argue whether they succeeded or not at times in the history of Christianity. But it seems like that's very much on the move now with these little nodes of light. I know I myself had a profoundly mystical experience in 2016 in the woods of Oregon and in meditation. And the thought occurred to me that I still don't know exactly how to deal with it 8 years later. But it was very much about the feminine side of God, the divine feminine, and in relationship and God and nature, for sure. I mean, the conscious awareness of nature. But coming with that, which, you hear a lot of mystical experiences produce, but also coming with this was this intuition that I like I say, I couldn't quite deal with or understand, but essentially it was this awareness that the three Abrahamic faiths, all from early times, have talked about some sort of end of the world experience, some sort of end of the world. I mean, apocalyptic kind of thing. We have in Christianity, of course, we have this, but also in Judaism, there was a concept of this. In Islam, there's a concept, but also outside in Buddhism, there's you can find it. In Hinduism, you can find it. And of course, in every age, I always discount those things. Like in every age, people say it's the end of the world, and of course, it proves to be untrue. But it hit me like, and yet knowing that every time the end of the world stuff comes up, people still these streams of traditions still end up like looking for it anyway. And now, is that just like psychosis, or some sort of mental issue that the cause of this, or is there this deep intuition running through that is harder to put our finger on? And I don't mean to suggest by this, and I did not feel like it was the end of the world, like in some sort of like final end. What actually, what it felt like was like within Christian, like for instance in Christianity and also in Islam, you talk about a second coming, but it wasn't like the second coming of Jesus. It was something that was as profound as Jesus. Like it was like millions and millions of people who were turned on to a new consciousness, all kind of arising and collectively that being, in a sense, the second coming, or this profound, kind of almost a sheer point in human history. And like I say, I don't know what to make of that. It felt quite real at the time, and it continues to resonate with me. But what I do know is wherever I look across faith lines in different traditions and so forth, there seems to be a whole lot of people who are activating parts of their consciousness that had never, in ways that they had never done before, and being deeply experimental too, and accessing ways of knowing that they've never accessed before or been open to accessing, and a lot of experimentation, like wild churches and all this very rich experimentation. And I just can't help but think that that's going to result in something that's profoundly creative and is already producing some pretty creative stuff, and perhaps, just perhaps, maybe as much as we think that the literal end of the world could come, maybe there's something that we can't produce ourselves, but the Holy can produce for us. And it's not like God swooping in to save the day and and hey, you thought this was a problem, but I've taken it away from you. But rather comes in and metamorphizes us to then an arising in a way that we just can't quite predict.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I love the idea of a new consciousness. I think we're seeing some things dying for sure. And it's a painful, messy, just awful kind of death that we're seeing. But I also do think that new things are being born, and there's a lot of possibility in that. And I feel like people of faith have a critically important role to play, even though I'm not sure we have totally like woken up to the fact that we do. I think there's such an important role for people of faith in this moment. One of the things I took away from that class with Larry Rasmussen was this quote from Gus Speth that I trot out pretty much every day in some conversation. The people on my staff team and our board are probably tired of hearing me quote this. I've memorized it. I share it so often, but I think it gets at what you're saying. So Gus Speth taught in the School of Forestry, which was the forerunner to their environmental studies program at Yale for many years, and founded several environmental organizations. But he says, I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And I thought with 30 years of science, we could address those. But I was wrong. Of course, we've had way more than 30 years of good science, right? And we're not in a better place. We're in a worse place. So he says, I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And in order to deal with these, we need cultural and spiritual transformation. And then at the end of this little quote, he says, and we scientists don't know how to do that. And that quote like keeps me going, because Yeah, cultural and spiritual transformation, those are not within the purview of the science community. Selfishness, greed, apathy, those are not scientific concepts, but people of faith ought to have something to say about these things, right? We ought to have those are within our purview. So I do think it's this sort of this new consciousness, this new awakening, and people of faith have a critically important role, more than just, just advocacy for better public policy. We need better public policy, of course we do, but there are so many people doing that. And of course, we need all the carbon footprint kind of stuff, recycling and composting and light bulbs and solar panels and electric vehicles. We need all that stuff too. But there's also this really important role for people of faith to play and faith communities to play, which is really around cultivating the kind of cultural and spiritual transformation as we live into new ways of being. So my hope is that we can well, I don't think we have to. I think the Holy Spirit is waking people up to this moment and the role that we can play in the kind of transformation that I truly believe God wants to work in the world.
Yeah, yeah. That's beautiful. You mentioned selfishness, greed, and apathy. Well, shoot, that's been part of the Christian ecosystem since at least the 6th century. When we don't like to talk about the 7 deadly sins, but you just named 3 of them, right? Selfishness, that's pride. Greed is greed, and apathy is sloth. I mean, with those 3, we know what those things do and what they are, and we also know antidotes to them. That's very interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Well, maybe as things heat up, literally, and also in other ways in our world, maybe there is a sense that maybe things aren't quite broken enough, but when they get a little bit more broken, more people. I mean, just like even now, I mean, things are a little more broken, and we have all kinds of people willing to talk about stuff they never would talk about before. And we know that that a lot, if you look at the bell curve of that moves people from apathy into action, there's like the early adopters that are just going to get involved right away, and then the pressure mounts, and then you get a few more people in it, and then it goes up almost exponentially. And usually when it goes up exponentially, it's when enough people realize that there's community, there's other people like, okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not, for thinking this. And also that if I invest my energies, there's enough people who join me in this, that it's worth my time expenditure and the risk. Whereas before, a lot of people hang back. Like I really want to do something, but if I'm just going to waste my energy, I'm going to burn my social capital with some people and all these different things, I'm just going to do this for no good. But if you realize that there's actually a whole lot of people and you're acting in concert, oh, I'm actually making a difference. And that's when the bell curve goes exponential, when the people realize, oh, I'm actually making a difference.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and to draw back to the mustard seed idea, when you were sharing that beautiful reflection earlier, I was thinking about the work of Deborah Rienstra, who teaches at Calvin University, and she's written this great book called Refugia Faith, Seeking Hidden Shelters, Ordinary Wonders, and the Healing of the Earth. And she's talking about how, refugia is a scientific concept. Think about like when Mount St. Helens erupted and everything around it was decimated. And scientists looked at this and they thought, oh my gosh, we will not see life there for decades. Everything was barren. But what happened was within a matter of months, new life was springing up all over because refugia are these little pockets where life is preserved in under roots and rocks and little crevices. And this is a biological principle that in times of devastation, new life will quickly begin to emerge in these little refugia. And so she's asking this question, how can people of faith be people of spiritual refugia? These are mustard seed concepts, mustard seed communities, but it's from these places of, where life is preserved that life can then regenerate and refugia grow and they spread and they connect with other refugia. That's how real transformation happens. Not big bottom down kind of transformation, but these little pockets of life. And so my hope is that every faith community can be a little refugia where life is preserved and from which life can regenerate. This is the mustard seed kind of faith, literally.
Really is. Thank you for offering that. That reminds me that, even for those Christians standing on their ice, I was talking about this direct experience of the divine that surely would have come, as part of their awareness in their inner spiritual stuff. But also, a lot of our conscious awareness of God isn't just simply through the inward kind of stuff that happens in isolation from others. That actually it's that group, that community that God, we experience God through each other as well, and that's a direct experience of the divine that's flowing through us, and that's that hand that grasps yours as you're standing out there on the frigid ice, and that arm that wraps itself around you in support and so forth, that actually it conveys exactly a very tangible experience of the divine for us. And I think what you are reflecting here in this refugia idea is that we become part of each other's experience of God too. It's not just getting onto a mountaintop and meditating and feeling the presence and stuff, even though it does include that, but it's also in community with others. And certainly that I've experienced that just in community with you this evening, and also with the board, last week, and with those who in my own faith community. It takes a village. It takes a village to dance on thin ice. We can go it alone, but far better to dance together.
And a lot more fun too.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, Allen. It's been a privilege and a joy, and I look forward to, for my sake, not only seeing what develops, but even being a little small, tiny part of that development with the BTS Center in the future.
Thank you, Eric. Great to be with you tonight.
Thanks. And friends, this ends another episode of the Converging Paths podcast. And as always, I want to leave you with a blessing. Friends, may the Spirit, the Holy Spirit of the living God, made known to the world by many different names and yet astonishingly similar mercies, and made known to those of us who call ourselves Christians most fully in the form of Jesus Christ, our Lord, go before you to show you the way, go above you to watch over you, go behind you to push you into places you may not necessarily go yourself, go beneath you to uphold you and uplift you, go beside you to be your strong and constant companion, and dwell within you to remind you that you are surely not alone on this journey, and you are loved beyond your wildest imagination. And may the fire of God's blessing burn brightly upon you and within you and through you now and always. Amen. See you next week.